The winter of 1379 was mercilessly cold in northern France. Beneath the towering stone walls of a feudal castle, deep underground where sunlight never reached, a young woman named Eleanor sat alone inside a narrow stone cell. The air smelled of damp mortar and mold. Water dripped slowly from the ceiling, echoing through the darkness like the ticking of a clock counting down her fate. Eleanor was only 23 years old. Just 6 days earlier, she had been living as the respected wife of a nobleman. She was educated, well-mannered, and raised within the strict expectations of noble society. Now she sat barefoot on the freezing floor, wrapped in a thin dress that offered no warmth, accused of a crime she swore she had never committed. For 6 days, Eleanor listened to the sound of men working somewhere outside her cell. The constant hammering of chisels against stone echoed through the corridor. She heard the scraping of bricks being dragged across the floor and the low voices of masons speaking to each other as they worked. At first, she believed the castle was simply undergoing repairs. But as the days passed, the sounds seemed closer, more deliberate, as if something was being built directly outside her prison. On the 7th day, the hammering stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise had ever been. Moments later, the heavy wooden door to her cell creaked open. Several masons entered, carrying baskets filled with mortar and freshly cut stones. Eleanor stood immediately, relief flooding her face as she believed they had come to release her or at least explain her imprisonment. "What are you doing?" she asked desperately. None of the men answered. Instead, they began laying stone across the entrance of her cell. At first, Eleanor did not understand. She stepped forward, her heart pounding as she watched them carefully spread mortar between the bricks. Then realization struck like a blade through her chest. They were sealing her inside. She screamed and rushed forward, begging them to stop. She pleaded to speak to her husband. She begged to speak to the steward of the castle. Anyone who would listen. Her voice echoed helplessly through the corridor as the wall slowly grew higher. When the wall reached her chest, she could still see out into the corridor. Standing at the far end was the castle steward, a man she had known since childhood. She called his name, her voice cracking as she reminded him of who she was, of her family, of her innocence. The steward hesitated for a moment. Then he turned and walked away. The masons continued their work in complete silence. As the wall reached Eleanor's shoulders, she began to fully understand her sentence. She was not being imprisoned temporarily. She was being buried alive, sealed beneath the castle to die slowly in darkness and isolation. Her crime, according to her husband, was adultery. In much of medieval Europe, a husband's accusation alone could destroy a woman's life. Honor, reputation, and control over wives were considered essential pillars of social order. Once accused, many women found themselves trapped in legal systems that gave them little opportunity to defend themselves. Eleanor's fate, while extreme, reflected the harsh realities women sometimes faced in medieval societies where reputation could be more powerful than truth. But Eleanor was not alone in suffering under these brutal customs. To understand what awaited her in that sealed cell, we must step back several decades earlier and travel to a small English village, where another woman faced a punishment that would destroy her life long before it ended. Her name was Marjorie. In the spring of 1342, Marjorie stood trembling in the center of a crowded village square in Yorkshire. She was 31 years old and had been married for 14 years to a traveling wool merchant named Thomas. Her life had been ordinary and respectable until whispers began spreading through the village. A young baker named William had visited her home several times while her husband was away conducting business. Neighbors claimed they had seen him entering her house. One claimed to have heard laughter from inside. That was enough. In medieval communities, suspicion alone could grow into certainty. Reputation carried enormous weight, and gossip often functioned as social judgment. When word reached Thomas, he returned home furious and humiliated. To him, whether the accusations were true mattered less than the damage to his honor. Marjorie was brought before the local lord's court. She was not allowed to speak in her own defense. Witnesses repeated rumors. Her husband declared her guilty. The verdict was decided before she ever entered the hall. Punishment followed swiftly. Marjorie was dragged into the village square where a blacksmith stood beside a blazing forge. Inside the fire, an iron rod heated until it glowed bright orange. The metal had been shaped into a symbol intended to mark her shame. Permanently, villagers gathered in large numbers. Attendance at public punishments was often expected, as these events served as warnings to the entire community. Justice in medieval society was not only about punishment, it was about spectacle and deterrence. Two men grabbed Marjorie's arms as the blacksmith approached. She struggled instinctively, but her strength was useless against them. The blacksmith hesitated only briefly before pressing the burning iron against her cheek. Her scream tore across the square. The smell of burned flesh filled the air as villagers watched in silence. When the iron was removed, the scar was already forming, a permanent mark that would follow her for the rest of her life, ensuring she could never escape the accusation. But the punishment did not end there. Marjorie was locked into the pillory, a wooden device that forced her body into an agonizing position while displaying her publicly. A sign was hung around her neck declaring her crime. For hours, villagers threw refuse at her: rotten food, mud, and stones. Children laughed while adults shouted insults. Public punishments often encouraged community participation, reinforcing shared moral values through humiliation and fear. By the time she was released, Marjorie could barely stand. The following morning, she faced another traditional punishment known as ducking. She was strapped into a wooden chair attached to a long beam extending over a freezing river. Again and again, she was plunged beneath the icy water while the crowd counted each immersion. The official belief was that water would cleanse moral corruption. In reality, it was another form of humiliation and physical torment. Marjorie survived, but her life was destroyed. Her husband divorced her and seized all property. Branded and disgraced, she was unable to find work or shelter. Over the next 2 years, illness and poverty slowly consumed her until she died alone beside a roadside, buried without ceremony. Her story was tragic, yet it was not unique. Across medieval Europe, accusations of adultery could result in severe social and legal consequences that often lasted far longer than any official punishment. Noble women faced different but equally devastating outcomes. Several decades earlier in Burgundy, a young noblewoman named Isabella found herself trapped in a marriage arranged for political alliance. Married at 14 to a powerful baron twice her age, she lived a life of isolation within his castle. Years later, she developed a friendship with the household chaplain, a learned priest who shared books and conversation with her. Their relationship appeared innocent, but servants began whispering. The baron's adult son, fearing she might produce heirs who would threaten his inheritance, encouraged suspicion. Soon accusations followed. Unlike common women, noble women were rarely subjected to public torture because harming them risked violent feuds between powerful families. Instead, Isabella faced a different punishment, one sanctioned by both law and religion. She was forcibly sent to a remote convent. There, her hair was shaved, her noble identity stripped away, and she was confined to a small stone cell. She was told she would remain there for the rest of her life, performing penance for a crime she insisted she had never committed. For many women, convent imprisonment became a socially acceptable method of permanent removal, a living burial hidden behind religious walls. And now, returning to Eleanor, as the final stones closed the entrance to her cell, the last thin beam of light disappeared. Darkness swallowed her completely. Her screams faded into silence beneath the castle, unheard and unrecorded. Stories like Eleanor's, whether documented fully or preserved through fragments of historical record and legend, remind us how power, fear, and reputation shaped justice in the medieval world. They reveal how accusations alone could destroy lives and how entire communities sometimes accepted punishments that today seem unimaginable.